So now we're going back up to the global with this really important session. China, we've looked at China a few times over the past number of years, but it's great to have this particular panel come together to speak about it, and also looking at that idea of Ireland caught in the crossfire is very unique. So I'm very delighted and proud to welcome the host for this session, Finbarr Bermingham, Europe Correspondent for the South China Morning Post. So please give him a huge round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Vince. Welcome, everybody. Before we start, I just wanted to say hats off to the last panel. I mean, what an act to follow. As a parent, I found that very, very moving, so kudos to everybody who took part in that. Thank you to the organisers, to everybody involved in the summer school, to Vince Porrick, Pauline and team behind the scenes. It's been a brilliant day so far. Good to see Notre Dame doing events like this around Europe, Prague, Dublin and now Glenties. It's a wee bit surreal as a Fermanagh man who grew up about 50 miles from here and who has spent most of the last decade gallivanting around Greater China and Brussels, talking about Europe, China and the United States and Donald Trump, to find myself in West Donegal discussing the same issues. But on second thoughts, I was wondering to myself, maybe this is actually the best place to be talking about the fracture in the transatlantic relationship, the fracture in global politics, just a stone throw from the wild Atlantic way. It feels like that should be a chapter in somebody's book about this episode. We're going to get into all of that in about a 75-minute session. I'll try and keep my eye on the clock. We're 6 months into the second term of Donald Trump, in case anybody was wondering. Transatlantic ties are, to keep the metaphor going, on the rocks. The US is ramping up pressure on its allies to take a tougher line against China. China, meanwhile, is doubling down on its own state-led power projection. We have a military build-up that is a threat to Taiwan, cyber attacks and espionage claims in Europe, and a quite phenomenal development in technology that has seen China leapfrog many parts of the West in terms of its development of the high-tech goods that will power the future. Meanwhile, a little bit closer to home, Russia's war grinds on, propped up economically and diplomatically by China. And the EU is sort of caught between two superpowers and one former superpower, I suppose, who seem very comfortable with weaponizing the global economy. Neither of these players seem to have any regard for the rules to which we in Europe are so devoted. So it's a wee bit of a challenge, and here we are. Feels very remote to be talking about this in Donegal, but Ireland is actually at a very, I would say, dangerous intersection. It's almost like a microcosmic version of Europe being sort of caught in the middle of all of this. I mean, in Ireland, the Irish government has been very successful at attracting investment from all over the world. So you end up this situation where you have some of the biggest corporations from both the United States and China with their headquarters for Europe and Ireland. Huawei, TikTok, Shein from the Chinese side, Pinduoduo, Intel, Meta, Apple, all from the US side. So in a way, perhaps Ireland is vulnerable to some of these forces at play in this global trade and tech war. It's under fire, meanwhile, from, and I hear a lot of this in Brussels, from other EU member states for some of its economic policy. So it's a delicate moment for Ireland, and so it's not random, really, to be talking about these issues here. Sometimes it may feel that way. It feels like distant geopolitics, but I feel like these consequences are getting closer, and they're in some ways already landing in Ireland. So look, I'm delighted to be joined by some phenomenal speakers. I'll briefly introduce them. Mary Gallagher. If you said earlier that she was only told that she was saying her name wrongly for the first time quite recently. We call her Mary Gallagher in this part of the world, from the University of Notre Dame, who spoke so well this morning. To my left is Donnacha Beachain, who is a politics professor at DCU and a specialist on post-Soviet politics. Bill Emmott, meanwhile, to my right, is the former editor-in-chief of The Economist, and as of yesterday, just stepped down as the chair of the renowned think tank, the IISS. So welcome, everybody. There's a lot to get through. I've spoken enough, so let's move on to the real experts. We'll start with some big-picture scene setters. Bill, can I bring you in initially on this? 6 months of Trump. He's done everything he can to set fire to the relationship with Europe. I suppose he did that in his first term too, but the Biden administration spent the sort of what feels now like an interregnum trying to piece it back together again. So, your starter for 10, is the transatlantic relationship dead?
Great to be here. Thank you, Finbarr. My answer to that is that it's in a critical condition, but no, it's not dead. It's not dead because the transatlantic situation is geographical as much as anything else, and we don't escape that. As a Brit, as you can tell from my accent, I spent some years lecturing my fellow countrymen on the fact that we couldn't actually leave Europe because we are geographically there. And I think it's fair to say that the European and the American sides of the Atlantic Ocean also can't move. And they are the world's biggest trading bloc. I mean, together, this is $1.4 trillion or euros worth of trade. So this relationship will go on. And I remember in my time editing The Economist, the most frequent cover was probably fractures in the transatlantic relationship. But this is more serious because we have a trade war that has been launched by Trump, which he did not do on Europe during his first term. We have a very serious trade confrontation, which then will damage all sorts of other elements of trade. But he's very unpredictable. The final thing I'll say is, at the IISS, they have a thing in Singapore, a big event in Singapore. The American Secretary of Defense spoke there, and what was shocking was that he was positive about Europe.
That was a shock, I can confirm.
Yes.
Many people conveyed that to me.
And why was that a shock? Because he was saying to the Asians, look, those Europeans are behaving themselves better by spending more on defense. You should follow their wonderful example. So, in a way, this is a paradoxical.
Yeah, Mary made this point on the first session this morning about maybe the worrying lessons that are being drawn from this is maybe what Trump's doing is working in some weird way. He's getting the Europeans to spend more on defence and all sorts. That he believes the tariffs are working because the coffers are filling with import duties. But Mary, let's bring China into this question. Look, I hear every side of this argument, and I argue back and forth and with myself quite frequently about where Trump is actually going with China. I mean, anytime I look at my phone, he could be flip-flopping in any given direction. This is a guy who rallied up to, 140% import duties or something. I lost count. I think over 60, it doesn't really matter anyway. He also has sort of like stopped the banning of TikTok. He nominated an FBI director who holds millions of dollars worth of shares in a big Chinese company. He seems to want to do a deal with Xi Jinping. But at the same time, people tell me that he's pursuing a total, a recalibration of the global trading system in which China is not a part. So which is it? Is Trump a hardliner? Is he even a China hawk? Or, to use one of the acronyms that has wonderfully entered our lexicon this year, is TACO the trend that always prevails? Maybe you can explain what TACO is as well, for those who don't know.
Thank you, Finbarr. TACO, I believe, stands for Trump Always Chickens Out. Yes, and it has entered our lexicon. So, I think it's important for me to say, just as an American, that I don't support Trump's style of politics, nor his bullying approach to geopolitics. But as I said in the first panel, I think there are some ways in which his policies, and indeed some of the bullying, has proven to be more effective. And I wonder what U.S. politicians are learning about that, just generally, including on the Democratic side. On the TACO versus hardliner, it is really hard to tell. I think we all say, and it's true, that Trump is he's a deal maker. He's transactional. He doesn't necessarily want military conflict, but he'll use military force when he decides to. In the case of Iran, most recently. I would say so far, and this is very early on, and I think it's important to remember that even though he's very happy right now about the incoming tariffs, the compensation that's coming in, which is being paid by companies, as somebody pointed out also in the morning, by American consumers. But he's looking effective right now. But if we think about how we got here right now with the retaliatory spiral in the spring with China, in the end, he did fundamentally chicken out on the trade war with China, because China showed very clearly that it had leverage that it was prepared to use, and it was also pretty confident, and I think this is right, that their economy was not going to collapse if they had a trade war with the United States. Longer term, maybe that's not true, but Xi Jinping was willing to take that gamble, and it worked, and then Trump backed down. And so in a sense, even though he may say now we have a trade deal with China, the trade deal that we have right now with China, as far as we can tell, since we don't really know the details in and out, is that we have higher tariffs on Chinese goods, which will cause inflation in the United States. And China has shown that it can really stand up to Trump, which it's done. And I think that's really important as an example of TACO. On the other hand, there's a really interesting story recently in the news about NVIDIA and what Trump has done on NVIDIA. And NVIDIA is really interesting because I would say that is not an example of TACO. It's an example of the United States trying to figure out how does the United States compete with China. And so NVIDIA, Trump has basically rolled back the export controls on the NVIDIA chips to the Chinese market. This is actually what Finbarr is an expert in, so you're going to have to fill in all the details because I'm not an expert in export controls. He did that after a lot of successful lobbying by Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA. But he also did it because I think the U.S. government was starting to listen to what many people have been saying in the United States, is that you are not going to beat China by ceding the Chinese market to Chinese companies or by trying to exclude China from the global economy. You need to figure out another way, and that other way might be competing with Chinese companies toe by toe, in this case Huawei versus NVIDIA. So Trump rolled back those export controls that first came into place during the Biden administration, and I think is going to try to embrace a policy that is much more about competing with China versus just excluding China from the global economy.
It seems like there's sort of, I get the sense sitting in Europe, like we see these two like superpowers trading haymakers in like a no-holds-barred slugfest, and Europe is sitting here thumbing its notebook, and you see these massive moves like the weaponization of the rare earths and the sort of lot of the export controls and stuff from the United States. Is there a sense at this point, Mary, and then we'll move on to Donnacha, that they're sort of they're still sizing each other up, the US and China? And just as I may, a quick follow-up on that. I argued until I was blue in the face before Trump came back that China would prefer to have Trump in the White House than Biden because he does flip-flop because of TACO. Mm-hmm. Has that borne to be a sort of decent bet?
I don't think so. I think in the end, I mean, partly we all are affected by the uncertainty, and I think that's a very, very huge cost of Trump's governing style is the uncertainty. But I think in terms of his unpredictability and his willingness to do things that can be quite dramatic but maybe effective, put China into a tougher bind. Biden's policies were very predictable, I think. And in some cases they seem to be working. The Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act was all, I think, going in the right direction, rebuilding alliances. But in a sense, the Democratic Party is doing cleanup after Trump. And then, he comes back in and he goes in a totally different direction. So anyway, there's lots more to say. I think the other thing just about this tit for tat that you see with all this weaponization is that one thing that's happening is each country is revealing what it has. And as it reveals what it has, rare earths, export controls on electric vehicle batteries, that's what China just did this week, what the U.S. did with aircraft engines, we are revealing to each country what the other one has, and I think once you reveal it, it depletes its value. But I also think it can create some very unpredictable consequences that might come later down the line that we just can't predict where we're going to be going.
Thank you. Donnacha, these days it's always quite handy to have someone who can talk about Russia. Geopolitical events have made it very relevant again. I know that you're a post-Soviet expert rather than a Russia expert, but look, I think the first 2 months of this year, my entire reporting out of Brussels was basically people saying that because the US and China are getting, because they're fighting with each other, because they're getting further apart, that necessarily means that Europe and China will get closer together. I mean, this is what happened in 2017. Of course, there's a lot of water under the bridge since then, and I suppose my go-to has always been, it's difficult to replace a buyer in the United States with a seller in China. So I always thought there was a little bit of a sort of trouble in that sort of calculus, but purely on a geopolitical front, how much has the Russia factor played into the fact that this hasn't happened, bearing in mind there is an EU-China summit next Thursday that looks like it's going to be an absolute... I'll let you use your imagination to fill that blank, but Donnacha, where does Russia figure into all of this?
Well, firstly, I'd like to thanks for the invitation for coming here, and hello, Glenties. Like Finbarr, I'll just tell you a moment about myself. I'm a Clare man, so you're a Fermanagh man, and I spent not my time in Asia, but as is implied in my introduction, in the post-Soviet world. So I lived for a few years in Central Asia, in Uzbekistan, in Kazakhstan, in the Caucasus, in Georgia, Moldova, for example. Visited Russia many times, never lived there though, but always made a point of visiting the less visited places, not just Moscow and St. Petersburg, but Buryatia and the North Caucasus, where these people are now filling the trenches in Ukraine, because it's not only a colonial war against Ukraine, there's an internal colonial dynamic where they're bringing up ethnic minorities within Russia, so you're far more likely to die in Ukraine if you're from Buryatia, which is thousands of kilometers from the front line. This is a Buddhist Mongol people than if you're a Slav from Moscow sipping your latte in a cafe. That's just the reality of that war. I'm just back from Ukraine. I was there earlier this month, and as is my want when I visit a new city, if I was here in Glenties longer, unfortunately I have to go tomorrow, I'd visit the local graveyard. I'm a historian at heart, and I always think you find out a lot about local history when you visit a graveyard. And I made a point of visiting the city. I visited Uzhgorod in Ukraine. I visited the local graveyard. Now this is far, far from the front line. And I found that it was 3 graveyards. There was a 19th century, kind of 20th century graveyard. That was the core, and then you had a World War II graveyard, which was rather large. As you can imagine, more Ukrainians died per capita and Belarusians than Russians did in World War II. It's important to emphasize that, because Russia tries to monopolize the memory of World War II and the fight against the Nazis. And then there was another new graveyard, which was everybody who had been killed since 2022, and it was large. And they have this tradition in Ukraine of, we don't really have it so much in Ireland, they put a photograph always on the gravestone, and they're rather large. So you get a real sense of the person's humanity when you look at the gravestone. And they were really of all ages, young, old, people much, considerably older than me, and I'm certainly not militarily fit. People who had felt compelled to go to the front lines, because I said they were far from it. We didn't have this event which we'd organised. It was a scholarly event anywhere like Keough or Lviv. Simply, it would have been too dangerous. Still, we were woken up in the middle of the night by the sirens, and people are very aware that they're at war. Now, going to why I'm stressing this aspect, China supports this war. That's a reality. 80% of the kind of drone technology that Russia's getting is coming, kind of dual technology is coming from China. China officially says it's neutral, but it's a fiction. It's a different kind of relationship to the one that we're familiar with, because I'm old enough to remember the Cold War. I think many people here are old enough to remember the Cold War. Then the Soviet Union was the senior partner and China was the junior partner. In just 30 years, that's completely inverted. China's economy is 10 times larger than Russia's. The US economy is 14 times larger than Russia's. Russia's economy, and I stress this because sometimes we get overawed by the size of Russia, Russia's economy is smaller than Italy's. And we don't live in fear of Italy. The thing is that Russia has prioritized a military-industrial complex at the expense of delivering for its citizenry, as we try to do in democracies with housing and healthcare and education, imperfect as they may be. Which is why, by the way, North Korea, far, far from the front lines, is able to supply Russia with more ammunition than the entire European Union can supply Ukraine. Because, again, it's a militarized state. So Russia would be unable, I think, to prosecute its war without Chinese support. 240 billion, that's the figure of trade between Russia and China in the last year. Russia's had to find new customers for its oil and gas because Europe wasn't buying anymore. So China buys it at heavily discounted prices. Critical minerals as well are exported to China. And of course, there's a North Korean dimension, which I mentioned. It couldn't be done without China's facilitation as well. So it's thrown Russia an economic lifeline, because Russia is under huge economic stress. It also amplifies the Kremlin narrative at different diplomatic fora and whatnot. So I would say they're pragmatic partners in kind of an authoritarian axis. I don't think it will bring Europe and China together so long as you have this major, support for Russia, because, the European Union is made up of 27 countries, and, there are countries within the European Union which care more than others about the fate of Ukraine, but they have an equal voice. And so long as China supports Russia to the extent that it does, I can't see there being this kind of detente, irrespective of what happens in the United States between Russia and China in a fundamental sense.
Thank you. I would agree that this war has been a poison pill in the relationship between Europe and China. Mary, can I just ask you a quick follow-up on that? Whether you agree with Donnacha, is China sort of supporting this war? And if that's the case, why haven't they done more? Because obviously they haven't sort of gone beyond the provision of dual use. Yes, we do see some reports about, for example, drone factories building Russian drones in Xinjiang and so on, but they're not systematically arming Russia. So where's the line there, and how do you judge how China's view of this war has evolved since February 2022?
Yeah, there's so many interesting things about how the war started. Xi Jinping had just been with Putin during the Olympics. They signed the strategic
No Limits
Partnership. And there's a debate about, did Xi Jinping know what was going to happen? I would say he didn't know, and maybe Putin was able to draw him in slowly over time. But I would say, if anything, Chinese support for the war in Ukraine has only grown. I think it's quite clear now. And just last week, the foreign minister admitted as much to the Europeans that they don't want Russia to lose the war. They want, as long as possible, either for the war to drag out or for Russia to win. Partly because they want the United States to be distracted by Ukraine. So what does this mean for China's role in the world? What does it mean for it? I agree with Donnacha completely that it means that EU-China relations will continue to deteriorate, and not just because of the war, but there are other economic reasons as well. So I just, this is not going to be a war that is going to help China's role and image in the West, for sure.
Yeah, but why not go further? I mean, is it that a frozen conflict is better? Sort of keep the Americans distracted, keep them active in Europe, keep the Europeans distracted?
I think it's the sanctions. It's the threat of the financial sanctions. I mean, that's another interesting thing about how this weaponization is being unleashed by both countries, revealing sort of where the points of leverage are, but then of course clearly what the opponent then is trying to think about is, how do I get around that point of leverage? And so you've seen this be a real focus of China the last year or so, which is reducing its dependency on the U.S. dollar, getting more trade denominated in the renminbi, and eventually some sort of convertible currency, which will be very, very difficult for China to do with its current financial system. And it also has a lot of internal financial risk that it would open up to external actors. But at the same time, just doing what it's doing so far is reducing its dependency on the dollar.
Thank you. Look on to Ireland. Ireland, the title of the panel is about being caught in the crosshairs. We saw a bill when the first trade deal, if you want to call it that, I think it was about 4 pages long, of the latest Trump salvo was with the United Kingdom. And anybody who looks at China will look at that document and just see China everywhere, even though it doesn't mention China once. It's all about economic security, the pharmaceutical supply chain, the steel supply chain, and so on. And there's a sense that, Trump is perhaps trying to force countries, Western countries and non-Western countries alike, to choose between the United States and China. We've seen this from various senior figures in the Trump administration saying as much. And for a country like Ireland, which, as I said at the start, has been a gateway to investment into Europe from all comers. I remember interviewing Simon Coveney in Hong Kong in 2018, and he told me, look, we want to be a gateway for China to Europe. When I saw him again after COVID, he wasn't so effusive about that. But Can you explain whether you think, particularly for a trade and investment-led economy like Ireland, I mean, how do we here avoid being swallowed up in this clash of the titans? Is it possible, or do we have to sort of pick a side?
You certainly do not have to pick a side. I think if you ask yourself, what would it mean to choose? As soon as you try to find an answer to that question in a situation other than war, there is no real answer to that question that is operational. What would even Japan choosing between America and China consist of, let alone Ireland? What would Ireland's choices be in this? I think that it, and because, and although I mean it's of course conceivable that there would be a wartime situation in which choices would need to be made, but short of that, and for God's sake, let's stay well short of that. I don't actually think that there is even a conceivable policy path that Trump, I mean, I don't think this is, frankly, this is not something that Trump would be able to understand anyway, this level of detail, to be honest.
Can I give you an example?
Yeah.
How I think that may emerge? Okay, so Intel, big investor in Ireland, in a wee bit of trouble, as we heard earlier, ships billions of dollars worth of legacy chips to China from Ireland every year, you know. So maybe there's a choice. I mean, you know, as we said, Huawei is invested here. It has a big HQ here. Isn't there a time when the Trump administration or whoever comes afterwards, and I think the Biden people were working on this too, trying to say to the Irish, you know, Huawei's here if you want to ensure that these American blue chip brands remain headquartered in Ireland and keeping jobs here. Isn't that part of the choice? You know, we can force them, we can make life very uncomfortable for those American brands if you persist with hosting these Chinese brands.
Well, if that were to happen on a coherent basis, yes, that would consist of that. But we've seen this already with pressure in the first Trump administration, but then actually also under Biden, about Huawei's role in 5G telecoms networks, right? And yes, there was pressure on an intelligence basis that said you really shouldn't have this equipment at the core of your network because it could produce problems. The British argued back and said, no, we keep them out of the core, but we'll have them in the periphery. Nobody understood what the difference between the two was, really. But it then became blurred because of the transactional questions that Mary's talking about. Are you competing? Who do you want to prevent doing this business? And when they ring up, who do you say no? So Toyota, for example, the biggest Japanese car company, has just made a big new car investment in China, or has announced it rather. Does this mean that Japan is not choosing correctly between America and China? No, I don't think it does. It's a business decision. There are some circumstances in which very specific political questions about economic security, perhaps about intelligence, could lead to a forcing of a choice. But I think that they're pretty rare. You know, the Biden administration tried to develop this kind of thing about a small yard, high fence concept. You have a small range of things which you try to protect, but you protect them with a very high barrier. And some of what you're talking about is very much within that area, right?
Like the ASML sort of very narrow
exactly.
scope.
And as Mary's example with NVIDIA showed, you immediately find some difficulties in deciding which should actually be within this small yard. Mm-hmm. And you get Jensen Huang, the CEO of the world's most valuable company, on the phone, and you change your mind. Yeah. So it's not a very clear-cut issue. So I think that, you know, if you say, what's the interest for Ireland? The main interest for Ireland is remaining an open economy that welcomes capital and technology and business from everywhere. And that should be as much China as anywhere else, subject to intelligence issues. I think the other interest for Ireland is ensuring that we don't get into a situation of conflict, which could then lead to forcing of choices. Just to chip in on the question where you were asking Mary, and Mary's interesting answer about why hasn't China gone further on the Russia conflict, the answer is the same reason why the Americans have not gone further in supporting Ukraine. They do not want to get directly involved in a world war. And Ireland's interest is in avoiding a world war, if I may put it very simply.
I think we can all agree with that, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But I think there's just on that point, I think there are lots of areas where we are making these decisions, and the Trump administration, domestically in the United States as well internationally with other countries, for example, should American universities not accept Chinese students, right? Particularly in STEM fields, will we be stronger or weaker if we don't permit Chinese students to come to the United States, 90% of whom want to stay in the country after they pursue their PhD? There are some risks. I think it's more about mitigating the risks of that as opposed to making people choose. Because I think if we choose to try to isolate China, the problem for the United States is that it could end up isolating the United States at the expense of its own strength.
And sorry, to chip in quickly on that, I mean, I think that this is an excellent point. The other question is China a priority for the United States, or is something else in domestic politics a priority? And that's always going to be the question. So in terms of international students, Chinese students are not currently the priority. Foreign students as a way to bully universities, and Harvard in particular, are a priority. So you've got competing interests within the administration of the United States. Yeah. And by the way, we are, as you correctly said, only in month 6.
Thank you for that horrible reminder. That sobered me up. Right. I'm going to have a little bit of a pop quiz between the three panellists. See if you can tell me who said these 3 things. Now, the aim of this is we're going to talk about Europe and its positioning vis-a-vis both the United States and China. Okay.
We did not get any advance notice of this.
No. All above board.
Or any alcohol.
It's all above board. Okay. Quote number 1. You have the notion that if somebody hits you on the left cheek, you turn the other cheek. In our culture, we punch back. Anyone want?
Xi Jinping.
Very good. I would have been disappointed if you didn't get that, Mary. Famously quoted by Ling Ling Wei in the Wall Street Journal in 2018. Okay, next one. Come on. I'm a counterpuncher. I respond times 10. I mean, I respond pretty strongly.
He's an eater of tacos, I hear.
Yes, indeed. It is the taco eater extraordinaire. Final one. There's no necessity to escalate the situation or to further increase the additional tariffs which have been agreed upon by the EU. We do not want to retaliate.
Michael Martin.
Bit closer. Simon Harris. Okay, none of those 3 gentlemen are here to defend themselves, so let's get back to the panel. I wanted to sort of frame that in a way to look at how Ireland and the EU are reluctant to sort of retaliate and punch back. It's a very interesting stance. I mean, the Chinese have punched very strongly back against anything Trump's done. Seems to have maybe worked to an extent, with some pain incurred. And there is a sort of very rancorous debate in Europe about this. The French, of course, want the gung-ho approach. They want to use the anti-coercion instrument. They want to, take the US to the cleaners and so on. And Ireland is one of those more on the sort of wait-and-see side. Let's not, let's keep our powder dry. Let's not punch back. But Mary, I'll start with you on this one. I'm wondering. What do these, what do the likes of Xi Jinping and Donald Trump learn if Europe doesn't punch back, and does it matter?
Yeah, it's a hard position that the EU is in, and again, it's pretty early. And I think there's lots of things as we approach the new August 1st deadline and the 30% tariffs. There's lots going on behind the scenes, so I think the European Union is doing a lot. I think in trying to understand their strategy, because I do think it's a strategy, I don't think it's just, fear and, we're going to let him bully us, but rather how do we act in a more logical, rational, long-term, successful way. And this is something, and I think I might have said this earlier, but I say it a lot because people often ask me, why aren't you doing enough to stand up to Trump? This is in the domestic situation with universities. And, literally, I think the way I think about it is like, no, you don't want to wait. You don't want Donald Trump to wake up in the morning thinking about you, your university, your country, your company. And so I think the European Union is maybe being smart by not, when he launches a new tariff threat, just, continue to kind of slog on and bargain and negotiate. In the end, though, because I do believe he thinks it's a successful strategy and has proven to be so far, there needs to be a reaction, and it probably should come from the markets and from U.S. consumers once we hit really high inflation and, just rising costs generally, because then he will have to respond, and it won't seem like this is a tit-for-tat, kind of toxic masculinity fight between strongmen, but rather his policies are not working. And if Europe can do things that help that happen, I think that's the way they should go. But it will, of course, have indirect cost. It'll also have costs for Europe to have the same sort of inflation and tariffs.
Yeah, Donnacha, can I just bring you in on this briefly? I mean, do you think that this makes Europe look weak, or are you on the side of what Mary said, that it's better to hold fire? It sounds a bit like looking after a toddler. You let them exhaust themselves and hope that eventually they just pass out.
Yeah, well, I mean, Europe isn't looking for the fight, so it makes sense to wait and see what aggressive actions are actually taken, as opposed to the rather bombastic rhetoric that we often hear, because it's often not followed by actions for the TACO reasons that you gave. And of course, the US is becoming increasingly authoritarian. All those checks and balances that I learnt about when I was studying the US political system seem to have disappeared over the years. China is a dictatorship, so it can make concrete decisions much quicker than the European Union, which deals by consensus, which has 27 members. So it makes sense that, with the European Union, it's the lowest common denominator, obviously, but you can have this kind of trenchant, strong position, at least at the beginning, when you're a more authoritarian type of system.
Bill, do you want to say a word on that?
Well, I'd only say, first of all, I'd question how successful this has been on month 6. I mean,
from the European perspective?
No, from an American perspective. Okay. In other words, we are waiting to see the economic consequences, as Mary has rightly said. We haven't yet seen the tariffs really coming through in any way connected to the bombastic level of them. Yes, it's bringing in some tax revenue, but actually not a significant amount of tax revenue compared with the expansion of the deficit that the two houses of Congress have ratified. So I'm not clear that it actually will look as successful as he would like to suggest. He likes tariffs because it gives him a weapon with which to talk about and to threaten and to say, I'm going to put 200% secondary tariffs on Putin on countries dealing with Putin after 50 days and so forth. It gives him the bombastic noise. But so this comes back to what's the right view from Europe's point of view. The right view, I think, is to play it long. There's not a benefit from getting your retaliation in first if you're with a European-style trade relationship with the United States. But if he imposes a 30% tariff on whatever date comes to become the deadline, and we still don't know that, I would say that Europe will retaliate and should retaliate, and then we'll see the real battle.
Mary, when you sort of zoom out a little bit, I mean, my life seems to be reporting on how this dynamic is playing out in the EU-China relationship. I mean, back to what we were discussing about a potential détente in EU-China ties, hasn't happened. But also there's some surprise that the Chinese weren't willing to offer more in order to make that happen. right? And I hear from a lot of people much smarter than me that this is because Europe doesn't punch back. China feels it doesn't have to give anything because whenever the punishment arrives from Europe, it will have gone through the filter of 27 capitals and probably look a wee bit measly. They can absorb whatever it is that Europe's going to throw on them. Do you think that the same logic applies to what we've described, from what we've described in the sort of dealing with Trump to dealing with China?
For the EU, yes.
For Europe, yeah. For
Europe, yeah. Right now, it seems like that Europe doesn't really have the leverage over the Chinese that it thought it had with market access. As I said in the morning, I think the rare earths, critical minerals, export controls that Xi Jinping implemented over the past couple of months really taught the Europeans a lesson. But there are other things going on, too, related to the ability to pick off different countries that have different interests in China. Hungary, of course, is one, but also Germany. Merz is going to send a large delegation of German executives. And
he's
companies.
going with them. He's not just sending them.
No, and going with them. And even seeing how the summit that's happening next week was panning out, and it was really going poorly. And one of the things that was canceled was a visit to Hefei in central China, where Volkswagen has a big new production and development research and development site for electric vehicles. Now, I don't know, I'm not on the inside. I'm sure there are people in the room who know much more about what actually happened. But think about how humiliating that would have been for the EU to go to a city where Volkswagen is hiring and training engineers as it lays off automotive workers in central Germany, right? So those types of lessons that Europe is learning right now, I think, are necessary. I think Germany in particular, and Volkswagen as well, as its major automotive company, but Europe more generally has been very complacent and I think underestimated China dramatically, even though China in 2011 said it was going to leapfrog over the industrial combustion engine and go right to EVs to be competitive globally in automotive. And that's what they've done. And Volkswagen did not see the writing on the wall until it was far too late.
Hidden in plain sight. An interesting little anecdote based on the Anhui visit. I mean, the reason why that was chosen, apart from the Volkswagen story, is that Ursula von der Leyen, who's the president of the European Commission, her father was previously the Prime Minister of Lower Saxony, and when he was in that role, he created this partnership with Anhui province that exists to this day. So it was an attempt to, from the Chinese perspective, I think, generate a little bit of positive mood music ahead of the summit, but then when they realized that the Europeans weren't really playing ball anyway, they said, screw it. Li Chang has to be in Beijing that day. We can't do it. So it's down to a one-day summit. So, Joseph Borrell used to call these things the dialogue of the deaf, and I feel like Thursday next week may amount to much of the same. Donnacha, these issues, talking about growing, increasingly assertive China, we haven't talked about Taiwan yet. There's obviously growing concerns that certain dates in the calendar are approaching. When will China attempt to unify with Taiwan or invade Taiwan, however you want to phrase that? We've got Russian expansionism and so on. Again, it does feel quite remote if you're sitting in Glenties or in Enniskillen or wherever you may be, or in Clare in your case. Why should people in Ireland care about these things that seem very far away?
I see Bridget laughing in front of me in the front row, and 35 years ago I was an undergraduate student at UCD, and Bridget, she probably doesn't remember me, I certainly remember her. She was my professor. That makes us both feel very old, I know, but I remember I remember that the seminal work at the time was Francis Fukuyama's The End of History. We were told, you have to read this book. And essentially the argument is that with the collapse of communism in Central and Eastern Europe, that the argument had been won about what was the best way to organize society. People had tried monarchy, they had tried fascism, they had tried communism, and liberal democracy was the only system of governance left standing, and that it was inevitable that these regimes that were autocracies would democratize. And I was in East Germany in 1989 in August. I remember being told this regime is 40 years old, it's going to last forever, and it just collapsed a few months later. That's where Vladimir Putin actually was when I was there in August. He was the KGB officer in Dresden, had to go back to Leningrad as it was very quickly. The Soviet Union collapsed, apartheid ended in South Africa, the peace process started in Northern Ireland. There was a general optimism. Even Tiananmen Square, which of course was a massacre and a bloodshed, there was this notion that this shows that even in China, there is this kind of notion that they are not going to accept, a dictatorship indefinitely. Fast forward to where we are today in 2025. Rather than that prophecy coming true of autocracies democratizing, what we're seeing is exactly the reverse. We are seeing the autocratization of democracies. Trump is perhaps the best known example, but we have lots of mini Trumps in Europe, and Ireland is part of the European Union. And, we've seen the damage that Hungary can do. We've seen what Robert Fico is doing. The last batch of sanctions against Russia over Ukraine was blocked by Slovakia and Fico in Slovakia. So, we live in this increasingly globalized world, because back then when we were all reading books in the library in UCD, there was no internet, but we live in an increasingly globalized world. We know a lot more about each other. And I would argue that neighborhoods in this world that we live in today are not based exclusively or indeed even primarily on geography. In that sense, Ireland as a consolidated democracy has far more in common with Japan or South Korea or Taiwan than it has with countries that are geographically closer. Look at Estonia and Russia. They're neighbours, but they live in entirely different political galaxies. So it's values, not geography, that binds peoples and countries together. And on another pessimistic note, and I'm full of joy and cheer-eyed as I know, but we are one, and I haven't plucked this statistic out of nowhere, there are people who do the data on this, but we are one of, Ireland and the people of Ireland, 12% of the global population live in a consolidated liberal democracy like Ireland. 12%. So we are an endangered species. We are not the global majority. We forget that in Ireland because we are a democracy, we're a resilient one, we have imperfections, but I tell you, if you travel, we're good compared to what's out there. And we're surrounded by democracies like us. The further out you go, the more you realize how different we are. And as I said, the momentum globally is more with the authoritarian states. It's more with, as I said, both from China, but also, as I said, within democracies. I'll end maybe on a point that Emmanuel Macron made when he said that Europe has to cease being a herbivore. That it would have to be an omnivore at least. That we are living in kind of a dangerous world. And Europe has difficult choices to make. I mean, again, the world that I grew up in was one, Europe was depending on cheap Russian gas, and it was getting cheap American security. Neither can we depend on going forward. That's a long way of saying a lot has gone backwards. Progress is not unidirectional, as we were told as undergraduate students. Yeah. It's going backwards.
Yeah, history's back. Bill, you wrote a book last year about Taiwan. Why should people in this part of the world give a toss about that part of the world?
Well, very charmingly put.
Thank you.
Typical journalist.
Takes one to know one.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's two reasons. The first reason, with Taiwan, is that the stakes are enormously high. The likelihood of conflict is not high, in my view, but if a conflict were to take place over Taiwan, it would very likely be the first conflict between two nuclear-armed superpowers in history. It would be a conflict for control over the Western Pacific, over a region that is highly contested, and that would be a proxy for a conflict for, in effect, global leadership. So the likelihood, if there's a single conflict in the world which holds the highest risk of becoming nuclear, it's Taiwan, in my view. So that's why anyone in the world, whether in Glenties or in anywhere, should give a toss about Taiwan, because the stakes are enormously high. The second reason fits in with Ireland's own history. Irish people, for very good reasons, care about colonialism and occupied countries. The fact is that China's claim to Taiwan is weaker, historically, than England's claim to Ireland. How?
Now you're talking their language.
How? There you go. Why is it weaker? What I mean by weaker is that if you say, oh, this is historically a Chinese territory, and you look at the facts, it's been a Chinese territory for 200 years until 1895. It was not a Chinese territory before then. It was obviously geographically proximate to China. Ireland, and I say this provocatively, obviously, unwillingly, was an English territory for 800 years. So don't argue from history, from numbers of years or whatever, as to whether Taiwan should be part of China or not. China's claims to Taiwan is based on history, but based more on recent history, and of course based on its own sense of wishing to end two wars, really, well, three wars in a way, in its favor, but particularly the Chinese Civil War. So, I mean, there's obviously very strong motivations on China's part, and I'm not wishing to diminish them, but I think that self-determination and colonial reason is a reason why people in Ireland should care about Taiwan.
Very well said. I always get a bit confused when I look at the voting patterns of certain Irish nationalist parties in the European Parliament. Sometimes they tend to have more affinity with the big would-be colonial power across the strait than the small island trying to survive. But anyway, let's zoom out a wee bit again, away from Ireland. Can I ask, let me see where I go with this. Okay, Bill, we'll stay with you, and if anyone else wants to muck in here, please feel free. In the last 6 months, we've heard a lot of talk, I mean, I guess for the last 3 years, about de-risking from China, you know, strategic autonomy. We heard a lot about strategic autonomy under the first term of Donald Trump. I hear from certain European diplomats a lot now about how we need to de-risk from both the United States and from China. As Donnacha said so gracefully, the era of being reliant on cheap Russian energy and cheap American security probably over. Some people would say perhaps the era of being too reliant on China for trade may be added into that mix. Where do you see that going? I mean, somebody in this morning's panel made the point that, I think it was maybe Bridget, that you hear less about an independent Europe now than you did maybe 3 months ago. Is it possible, and is it likely, for Europe to be truly strategically autonomous?
No.
I knew you were going to say that based on your first answer. I should have asked somebody else.
No, but I do think that Emmanuel Macron's desire and campaign to promote what he's called grandly strategic autonomy is the right one, in that Europe needs to have more agency, more influence over its own destiny in all sorts of ways, particularly over defense, but also economically, and that it has been, the great superpower of globalization, if you like, in many ways, and that produces risks. And I think, as well as having overexploited the peace dividend during the 1990s and 2000s. So I think the aspiration to make Europe stronger and have more options is absolutely the right one, and Europe can do that. But this is the most interconnected region in the world, so it's not going to be disconnected. So autonomy should not be taken too literally, I suppose, is the answer that you would expect from me.
Yeah. Did you want to say something, Mary, on that?
I did. I mean, I think this is more in regards to the United States, and I agree about the encroachment of authoritarianism in many places, including in the United States. But at the same time, I would also argue that we're only a few months in, and a lot of what is going on right now in terms of the what we might call self-censorship or tactical retreat by universities, civil society, Congress, corporations, law firms, the media, is a lot around we have very little leverage over this administration right now if you oppose it. Not that everybody does, certainly. They've overstated their mandate, right? They've really grasped onto this idea that the Trump administration has a huge mandate to rule, but in the end, Kamala Harris lost by just a small amount, but the Electoral College makes it look overwhelmingly. And so there is more affinity between the United States and Europe, for sure. than compared to China, along with Korea and Japan and Taiwan and other places like that. And I would imagine that what we will see in the end is that democracy in the United States responds, but it responds mostly through elections. And we won't have an election for, another year and a half nearly.
Yeah. Well, can I ask you, as somebody who has made a very excellent career out of studying China, and you notice the changes in America, maybe there's some reductive comparisons between the two, but I mean, do you see with the sort of, I mean, when I talk to European business people who are travelling to America at the moment, they take a burner phone. When I lived in Hong Kong and I used to go on the high-speed rail into China, I used to leave my phone in the locker at the station and hop on over to Shenzhen or Yangshuo or wherever it was that I was going. I mean, do you notice any parallels from your career studying China and how things are evolving in America?
Yeah, I think the self-censorship, I don't know if anybody remembers or read the old essay by Perry Link in New York Review of Books about the anaconda in the chandelier, where you don't talk about things simply because you know that the party is listening, and the government doesn't need to do anything to you because you do it yourself by self-censoring, by stepping back. I think a lot of people in the United States are doing that now, in fear of, like I said, being retaliated against, being in the crosshairs. And so that is something that we learn. I do think, going back to what's happening globally around strongman politics, strongmen are attractive during moments of uncertainty. People are looking for a decisive leader, somebody who can get things done. And you clearly see that in the United States in Trump. But when we think about the way in which democracies govern, they do so messily, they do so more slowly. I think in the end that means also democracies make less catastrophic mistakes. And so it's going to take a longer time to get there, but I think eventually there will be the swinging of the pendulum back even in the U.S.
Fingers crossed. Donnacha, let's get back to Europe now and back to this sort of assessment of how Europe has evolved in recent years. Obviously responded very strongly and very uniformly, at least most of the way, to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I was watching the sanction packages drop very successfully, and of course Hungary, Slovakia now have been spoilers, but it's quite admirable what they have been able to get done. And then again, there's the debate going on now in Brussels about how and whether Europe should respond to the sort of dual threats coming from the superpowers, neither of whom seems to be in the mood for making any concessions to Europe. How do you see Europe, the perception of Europe as a geopolitical actor? We hear a lot of talk about how this is now a geopolitical Europe, from von der Leyen and people like that. How do you think that is perceived from other powers?
Well, firstly, I would diverge slightly from your glowing assessment of the EU support for Ukraine.
Please.
I'd just say, I'd leave it there, I'll park it there because that's not the question you asked, but I think the EU, had it done much more, could have had a really decisive effect, particularly in 2022 when the Ukrainians themselves, without any support, had pushed the Russians back from Kyiv, back from Kherson, back from Kharkiv. The momentum was completely with them, but the European Union national economies were giving less than 1% of their GDP to Ukraine. It was a tiny amount considering the deep pockets that are there and considering what's at stake. And even going back to what Bill was saying about Taiwan, I was in Taiwan 2 years ago, and they are absolutely convinced that how the war ends in Ukraine will have a direct impact on China's calculations regarding Taiwan. And as you said, Taiwan is probably the place most likely to trigger a nuclear conflict. So there we go. But going back to how the EU is perceived, traditionally the EU has been perceived, and I'm going back even to my lecture notes from Professor Laffin all those years ago. It's
for those who can't see, she's got her hand over her face.
Because she was our professor in European integration. But no, the EU has been traditionally viewed as a payer rather than a player, as an economic heavyweight, but not a political or geopolitical heavyweight. And I think, from the perspective of Moscow, it tends to view NATO and the USA as the real threat or interlocutor rather than the EU. So the EU, in that respect, is respected rather than feared. What I worry about is the division within the EU and the need for unanimity, and I mentioned what impact that has on supporting Ukraine. I'll just again, because I'm a historian at heart, trapped in a political scientist body, but I go back to the 18th century and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which is one of the biggest entities in Europe, stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. And they had, comparative to its time, not to today's times, they had one of the most democratic systems at the time, where the Sejm, it's still the same name for the Polish Parliament, the Sejm had this mechanism whereby any member of Parliament could block legislation. And what happened is that the Russian Empire and the Prussian Empire started buying off individual parliamentarians, who then paralyzed the Sejm. And what happened? The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was gobbled up in 3 bites in the 18th century until Poland was wiped off the map for 123 years. Now, where am I going with that? We also have a very democratic, consensual system in the EU based on unanimity, but it's paralyzing, and it prevents us from being that geopolitical actor. And as I said before, authoritarian dictators have that advantage of being able to act decisively. The EU has to reform in a way that allows it to respond decisively to threats to all our interests, which are so self-evident as this panel illustrates.
Reforming on unanimity while needing unanimity is a challenge in itself. It's some sort of paradox there. Look, before we go to questions from the audience, I'm not quite sure how long we have left because we started late, but I wanted to ask a few quick-fire questions to the panellists. Just take 30 seconds each on this point. First one, Donnacha. Who is the biggest threat to the people of Donegal? Is it...
I know the answer to this already, but
it's not. We're not talking about Jack O'Connor, okay? Is it Donald Trump or Xi Jinping?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I was going to say Kerry, yeah, but there you go. I'm really divided on that because I think Donald Trump. I mean, Ireland's relationship with the US has traditionally been remarkably strong, but Donald Trump is taking to the US to a place where it's really unrecognizable to Irish people. And if he's taking the US on a trajectory which it can't reverse, that relationship, if it disintegrates, would be far more detrimental, I think, to the people of Donegal and Ireland generally. Because our relationship with China at this moment in time is relatively peripheral to that of the US, economically, politically, culturally. So I think Donald Trump, I'll go with that. I've convinced myself.
Bill.
Same question.
Same question. Run robin on this question.
Well, I think definitely. I would absolutely agree. I think particularly, you have to go short term or short to medium term versus long term. Xi Jinping, if he's a threat to the people of Donegal, it's a long term issue. Whereas the short term is definitely the answer is Donald Trump.
Yeah. Mary, do we have consensus?
I mean, I think I'd need to argue against consensus.
Please.
So that I could at least have. Although I totally understand the reasoning, I think that what I worry most about Trump's impact is the long-term. You know, he's only in office for 4 years, but he can have such dramatic impact on U.S. soft power and on the relationships with European allies, and that's clearly happening. At the same time, I think if we think about long-term. The geopolitical changes, the economic changes, where Europe is, both geographically and in terms of its industries, I think China, perhaps not Xi Jinping as a person, China is the pacing threat to worry about. And it doesn't necessarily mean war or subjugation, but it will mean dependency of a kind that I don't think Europe had to suffer through with the United States. I don't think it was that kind of relationship. But I think in the future, if EU-US alliance ruptures, EU will necessarily be drawn into China's sphere of influence, which will include Russia.
Donegal would look very different in that instance.
Yeah.
Final round robin. Mary, I'll stay with you quickly. One single recommendation or warning to Irish policymakers?
I know very little about Irish politics. I think just being here and also being in other parts of Europe, including Germany recently, I think the main thing is to think about how does the European Union, sort of what Donnacha was just talking about, how does the European Union act decisively with legitimacy? I think that's the key going forward. And that does involve things around geopolitics and military power.
Bill.
Yeah, I would go, I'm afraid, with that consensus. I think that the most important priority is Brussels and everything to do with the European Union. And do not, I suppose the recommendation is, do not undermine or divide that at all in any way, because you depend so much on it and you are part of a greater thing than yourselves.
As a general principle, I would say avoid getting into economic arrangements, agreements that involve sacrificing your fundamental values.
Thank you, everybody. Okay, we've got some time for Q&A. Lady here, and then a gentleman, two in the second row here. Don't worry, Lisa, I see you. Do we have some microphones? There's two people in the second row, a lady and a gentleman. Yes.
Okay. So my question is...
Could you just introduce yourself?
Yeah, sorry. My name is Neil O'Sullivan.
Let's make it no soliloquies, guys. Let's keep it to the questions.
Okay. Very quick question. How well in Ireland do you think, and particularly for the Irish government, do you think we understand China? Sometimes I think we think China's government is just like any other Western government. For example, a few years ago, the Irish Minister for Education signed an MOU with the Chinese Ministry of Education to supply Mandarin teachers to Irish schools. Now, you can imagine, we were talking about education and the growth of our children earlier. You can imagine the version of certain events they will present to our young people. So, that's the question. How well do you think in Ireland we understand China or the Chinese Communist Party?
Thank you. Lady here in the black top.
Hi. I asked this question of a person very senior in the British military who happened to be staying in our house recently. And usually when I ask it in Ireland, people laugh at me. But he's responsible for mobilising the civilian population when the reservists and the normal army are depleted. He's training taxi drivers and hairdressers in Ukraine to go to the front line in 7 weeks. And I said to him, what's the likelihood of Russia invading Ireland as an act of provocation in a thing? And, well, he took it very seriously. He said it's a serious concern of the British that might happen. So I wondered what you thought about that being more real.
And sorry, just a post-question introduction.
Oh, my name's Anne O'Connell. I live in the UK as well.
Thank you. And lady in the green next to Neil, just behind you.
Thank you. More Neil Lera. I'm just looking at the heading there. Ireland, Trump and the China dilemma. Ireland is a very small country. China is a very big one. Has Trump become a country? And if so, is he the king of it?
As a newspaper man, I would often say that the editors choose the headlines, right? Donnacha, do you want to take a stab at the first question about how well, as the Irish professor on the panel?
Well, I could take a stab briefly at all three, if I may, but it'll be very brief.
Be quick,
In terms of how well we understand China, collectively not very well. I lived in authoritarian systems for a long time, and it's just even in the small little things. When I was living in Uzbekistan, every time the president drove from his residence anywhere, they shut down all the main streets and everybody had to go indoors, essentially, and he was followed by security guards. I was on a flight from Dublin to Brussels the other day, and I couldn't help but notice Simon Harris there getting on the same Ryanair flight, carrying his bags. Now, you might say, of course, that's the way that's what we're used to. But just in terms of how we can't understand that mentality of hierarchy, I think, in the same way, because nobody in Ireland allows anyone to get too big for their boots, or they're kicked out to the next electorate. It's a big difference when you can't get rid of the people who are in power and they're imposed upon you. That's number one. So we don't understand, I think, collectively. In terms of Russia invading Ireland, military invasion, unlikely, but invasion can take many forms. And much more likely hybrid warfare, cyber warfare, for which we're distinctly ill-prepared. And in terms of military invasion, I interviewed for a book I just put together the president of Moldova. She's convinced that had the Ukrainians not managed to push back the Russians, that Moldova would have been next. Estonia, of course, is a country long under the Russian Empire with an ethnic Russian minority, which Russia has expressed an interest in. It's a member of the EU. We're a member of the EU. So it all comes down to our sense of who are we. Okay, it might not be Ireland in terms of the territory, but people who we share so much with, we share a common economic unit, political unit, they may come under pressure in a way that we might not. And then the question will arise of what are our obligations towards these people. And finally, it's a great question, is Trump king of the US? I think we try and do that because there's still part of us, going back to the point I made, of our cultural relation with the US. We don't want to think that Trump is the US. So we've no problem talking about China, sometimes in dismissive terms, but we try and hold out this hope that Trump is an outlier. And I think that's why we personalize it and say Trump does this, Trump does that, when we would otherwise say the US does this, the US does that. I think that's why there is that distinction, whoever put that title together, which we're very perceptive for noting it.
Do you guys want to come in on either of those, or are you happy to...
Just on the Chinese, the education question. So I do think that based on some knowledge of things like this and Confucius Institutes and Irish universities, I think Ireland is really naive about this kind of stuff, and it needs to get better at it. And research security is real, and influence operations are very real and very effective.
Yeah. And the only thing I'd add on that is that sensibly, Ireland's biggest public investment in a diplomatic institution, if you call it that, an embassy, has just opened in Japan, with the new Ireland House in Japan. And my top advice on this would be, A, understand that none of us really understand China very well. But secondly, I think Mary's right about the history of it. But if in doubt, ask the Japanese.
We've got time for another round of questions. The lady on the side, Lisa, in the white. While you're walking past, there's a lady here in a colourful shirt. Maybe you can give her the microphone.
Thank you. Una Monaghan. Just in terms of geographical positions that were mentioned earlier, about the physical position on the planet, Ireland being where we are in Europe, does that bring back the question yet again about Irish neutrality in terms of allowing planes to land and our position between America and Russia?
Over at the computer desk, over with it.
I'll raise you. Thanks. Finbarr, you had a very interesting story a couple of weeks ago revealing that the Chinese foreign minister told the chief diplomat in Europe that it was in China's interest for Russia to win in Ukraine. So I'm wondering, Mary, possibly for you and anybody else, where do you think, or why do you think it's still useful for the EU to go to China next week? Can they achieve anything? And also, if you look back at the tariffs that they put on electrical vehicles to try and stop and protect, stop the imports and protect the Germans, it hasn't worked. Exports have gone up and up and up, and the German auto industry is in crisis. So.
Is there one more before I think this will be the last, down here in the green? Yep. There you go.
Mary Rose Greville. I have spent a lot of time working in Africa and attended a talk recently in Trinity about the scale in which China was moving into different parts of Africa and exploring it. I wonder what the story would be there. Thank you.
Donnacha, do you want to tackle the Irish neutrality question?
Yeah, sure. I mean, firstly, neutrality, it's a very nebulous concept because it's not in the Constitution, it's not defined, and even the reasons we're neutral are militarily non-aligned. I would argue we've never been neutral, but we've always been militarily non-aligned because we're not a member of a military alliance. Even that rationale has changed over the years. So when we were invited to join NATO, it's often forgotten, back in 1950 by a man called Ted Achilles in the State Department. I read his messaging back and forth. We said, we're all in favour of joining NATO. We think it's a great idea. We just won't join a military alliance with the power that's occupying the 6 counties. Sean McBride was the foreign minister at the time. And then, of course, it evolved into something else. That's no longer, of course, no one mentions that when NATO membership is up there. It's all about a tradition of military neutrality and whatnot. Neutrality can be a very noble position to have, especially when one has very little military clout, but it's something that you have to pay for. If you look at the Finns before they joined NATO, because of course they had to re-evaluate their options once the Russians invaded Ukraine, they were paying a huge percentage of their economy they had conscription. The Swiss as well have conscription. They pay a large amount. So Iceland, which is a member of NATO, has no army, because its attitude is that, well, if it gets attacked, they've all these powerful friends who will come to its aid. So, we sometimes miss the point in a way. We just need to defend ourselves. Either we join a military alliance or we pay for it ourselves. But there's no middle way. We seem to think that there's a third way of not paying for defence and not being part of a club of friends who will come to your aid. And there isn't such a precedent. So we're basing it on this notion that we'll never be attacked. But as I said, there are many ways you can be attacked. We're the only EU member state, as far as I know, that doesn't have a primary radar system. And I had a wonderful conversation one time, I remember, in Central Europe, won't name the country, where I was explaining that we didn't have an air force of any sort. And they said, well, that makes sense. You're an island, but sure, you must have a great navy. And so... probably it's good that they don't know how little we spend. I mean, up until recently we were spending...
Did you just nod along?
Yeah, well, I didn't want to disabuse them of the notion. But we spent, the last time I looked, it was something in the region of 0.2% of our economy on defence. The Poles are getting close to 5%, and they're reintroducing conscription. Now, again, we are both members of the European Union. We do have, under Article 42, some mutual kind of assistance obligations. I think we need to have a serious conversation. I'm not saying that has to be prescribed where it goes, but I think that, like people were saying, do we really understand China? I think when it comes to defence and security matters, we also are very much at the embryonic stages of a discussion.
Bill, as somebody who has, your former, now former think tank was very well regarded for bringing together groups of people who didn't necessarily agree with each other. Can you explain perhaps why are the EU leaders going to Beijing, even though they disagree on almost everything these days?
Well, because I think that, perhaps to use a different phrase from a different thing, they know that they can walk and chew gum at the same time. And that is, of course, the cleaned-up version of that story. No, I don't see any contradiction over it. I think talking is very important. Understanding. We said, how well do you understand China? Well, the more that they talk, the more understanding can be built. I don't think that there's that we should expect meetings to have massive, great strides forward. Certainly your journalistic judgment of it is correct, of course, what will happen next week, but that doesn't mean it was a waste of time. It's just we shouldn't bother to cover it, and I would agree with that.
Mary, do you want to jump in on that question and also the China-Africa one briefly? So Lisa's question, just be if you want to comment on the summit, but also the EVs issue, and then there was a question on China-Africa.
So on the summit, I think it's the 50th anniversary of EU-China relations. I think it's difficult to cancel. I do think it looks bad, but I think everybody's going into it with low expectations. So maybe maybe something good will happen, or not so bad will happen. The EV tariff's super interesting in the way in which, I think the EU, as it does, really tried to be very rule-based in its policies on the EVs subsidies. So they calibrated the subsidies something like 40% down to, I think, 7%. And the companies that are doing the best in terms of getting vehicles over include European companies, right? So Volkswagen is importing EVs from China into the EU market. Tesla is selling cars in Europe that are made in their Shanghai Gigafactory. And BYD, which is enormously cost competitive, can deal with the subsidies that it has. A lot of these are not state-owned enterprises. They've benefited from Chinese government subsidies, but they're enormously competitive, partly because the Chinese economy itself is in this race to the bottom on pricing in EVs. Now, the Biden administration put 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs, and it also put in a ban on connected cars that are made with Chinese technology. So there won't be Chinese EVs, by and large, in the United States. I think maybe one production facility in South Carolina. I have advocated for, and I would advocate it for Europe as well, that to be smart about it, and it goes back to the NVIDIA story, Europe and the United States, who are very far behind technologically on China on technology and EVs, should be allowing for Chinese private companies to invest here, or invest, in Michigan, which is happening, to be competitive in this market. Otherwise, they risk really falling behind. A technological shift, in the U.S., climate change is very polarizing, but even just on battery storage, energy security, technology in AI, and the energy needs there, we cannot lose this transition. We cannot fall behind this transition. And so there needs to be a more strategic and smart openness to Chinese investment in the locations, and then to hedge the risk as you need to hedge it.
And maybe 30 seconds on China, Africa.
I didn't. Sorry,
what was the question?
I didn't. Down. I don't remember the question.
Just the asker of that question. Do you want to just?
Oh, it's not on. Is it on? Yes. Sorry. Yes, I was asking. I had attended a talk, and I've done a lot of work in Africa about China moving into Africa in all kinds of different ways, and I wondered why it doesn't seem to be a topic of discussion in Europe at all. Thank you.
That's interesting. It's a big point of coverage in the United States, at least among people who study China's Belt and Road Initiative. Not only Belt and Road and infrastructure, which is done a lot of in Africa and other parts, also the critical minerals and the processing of minerals that are taken from Africa and then processed in China. That's also been really important to their success story. Lots of things that are more contentious. I think China-African relations at the society level are more fractured. But if you look at public opinion polls, now, of course, the United States is not winning any public opinion polls right now. The Pew came out recently, and there's been a huge a drop. But among countries that are positive towards China, they tend to be in the global south. In Africa, and very much so in Southeast Asia, and in some Latin American countries too. So that's another thing to think about in terms of what do people experience in their daily lives. With China, they see infrastructure being built. They get technology. There's a lot of media that is now Chinese dominated, but in their local languages. So again, I think not just in the EU, but in the United States, a huge amount of complacency about the rest of the world and its attitudes towards the West.
Now, I don't know who's in charge here about whether we have to wrap up now, because I know there was a 3 minutes. Okay, Sarah at the back had a question, and then there's a gentleman with the beard in the middle.
Thanks a million. I know everyone else is busting to ask a question, so forgive me. Donnacha, this is for you. I'm down here, the middle at the back. It's the Smurf at the back in white. Just on behalf of the Rest is History Club members, thank you for shouting out the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. We've been waiting for an episode for a long time. Ukraine, if you don't mind me pivoting back to that, I'm in an English conversation club in my village. We've a lot of Ukrainians in it. They're very divided, so we don't talk about the war because they have different opinions. But many of them privately think we do need to give land for peace. We reject absolutely the prospect of a Putin proxy puppet government in Kiev afterwards. But their biggest mistake was giving up nuclear weapons. And what they say is, if we get a nuclear weapon, we will be secure. Everyone has let us down. They feel absolutely betrayed by everyone. Do you think that's a realistic prospect for them to get one?
And really quick, this gentleman, if you could just introduce yourself. And
Jason Lemzurier.
Turn on the mic.
A Sasnak living in Ishowen. I think the elephant in the room, maybe it's beyond the remit of this session, but the elephant in the room is what's going on in the Middle East with Israel. And I'm wondering if that might develop into a proxy war between America and Russia now that they've been attacking Iran.
Okay, Donnacha, as quick as you can on that question, and then if anybody wants to...
The second question first, just on the proxy war, no it won't, because they were already asked, the Russians, to help the Iranians, and Vladimir Putin came up with a novel excuse of why he wouldn't reciprocate Iranian support that had been given to Russia in fighting in Ukraine. And he said, the 15 or 20% of the Israeli population are Russian-speaking. We wouldn't want to do anything to antagonize Israel for that reason, so sorry, Iran. So that's not going to be a proxy war. In terms of Ukrainians being divided on a land for peace. Yeah, it's understandable that there would be divisions. The thing is that they're not being given an option even right now of land for peace, because the Russian position is that they will go forward and take as much land as they can. Because Zelensky is on record, even as far back as November of last year in an interview with Sky News, of saying, we could contemplate the temporary freezing of the conflict in a way that we accepted the Iron Curtain. That there was a large part of Europe which we never accepted the legitimacy of these regimes. The Baltic states, which are now EU and NATO member states, we never accepted that they were legitimately part of the Soviet Union, but we didn't go to war over it either. But we waited for a better day when circumstances might change to facilitate their return to their natural, you might say, owners and democratic Europe. So I'm not surprised that there is a constituency there who are arguing that. Others are arguing that they should continue to fight on until all of the Russians are expelled. But you're absolutely right to focus on the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, when the Ukrainians were cajoled into giving up their nuclear arsenal, which was, I think, the third largest in the world, and they were in return given, it was a bit like Jack and the Beanstalk with the cow and the bean, they were given in return security guarantees which proved to be worthless from the US, the UK and Russia, guaranteeing their territorial integrity and sovereignty. So it's a very dark moment for those who, and there are many of us, and Frank Aiken indeed has a noble record in going to the UN and getting that nuclear non-proliferation treaty agreed by the UN. It's a very dark day for those who don't want the proliferation of nuclear weapons, because the lesson is that once you get them, you're untouchable, but once you give them up and you're not member of NATO or any kind of military alliance, you're fair game.
Thank you, Donnacha. Bill, proxy war.
Well, I think it does come back to this nuclear question as well, so I will connect the two. No, I think that Russia's had to retreat from the Middle East. It's basically lost its position in Syria already. It's ducked out, as Donnacha said, over Iran. I think the Middle East is an ongoing and continuing tragedy, but I don't see other outside powers choosing to get involved in it. I think the big question in the Middle East is what is going to be the attitude of the Saudis and the other Gulf states, as it were, the powers of the region, who are frankly not unhappy that Iran has been weakened by the whole series of things that have happened, but are skeptical about whether Iran will really give up its nuclear ambitions. Iran has shown, or the Iranian experience has shown, that if only it had got the nuclear weapon already, it wouldn't have suffered the attacks it had, from the point of view of many states. And I think that is a serious worry for other Arab countries within the region. And there is a general serious worry for the likelihood of further nuclear proliferation, because of the examples that we've seen in both Ukraine and now Iran, as to exactly what Donnacha said.
Brilliant. Okay, that's us. The best accolade I can give these panellists is that it's 10 to 6 and the room is still full. So thank you very much, everybody, for listening. And thank you to the panellists, and I hope you have a really good rest of the festival.